whip cracked once against the wooden post, and the entire clearing went silent. Lyra Voss did not scream. She only closed her eyes and let her knees buckle into the mud, her back burning under her torn shirt, while two small pups pressed themselves against her legs, shaking. 10 minutes earlier, none of this was supposed to happen to her. The gathering had been called for something else entirely. Cain Ashworth, heir to the Ashworth pack, stood at the center of the circle, wearing his ceremonial coat, the one with silver stitching along the collar that marked him as the future alpha. Beside him stood a woman named Celine Marrow, her chin lifted, her eyes glinting with the kind of satisfaction that only comes from winning something you were never sure you deserved. "The bond is confirmed," the pack elder had announced. "Cain Ashworth's true mate is Celine Marrow." Every pair of eyes in the clearing turned toward Lyra. She had been Cain's wife for 2 years. Not his true mate, not the one whose scent made his wolf howl in the night, but his wife all the same, chosen through arrangement, through duty, through a contract signed by two families who wanted peace between their territories. She had cooked his meals. She had warmed his bed on the coldest nights. She had stood beside him at every pack meeting with her spine straight and her voice steady. None of that mattered now. "Lyra Voss," Cain said, and his voice did not shake, did not soften, did not carry even a trace of the years they had spent together. "As of this moment, you are released from our bond. You will vacate the Eastern House by sunset." Released. As if she were a debt he had finally paid off. As if 2 years of her life could be folded up and handed back to her like a coat she no longer needed. She did not cry. She had promised herself, long before this day, that she would not give this pack the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. She simply nodded once, turned, and walked toward the edge of the clearing where the shadows of the old oak trees pooled thick and cool. That was when she felt the small hands grab her skirt. Wren and Finn were 5 years old, twins born blind during a raid that had taken both their parents the winter before. The pack had never quite known what to do with them. Blind pups were considered bad fortune among the older wolves, a weight the pack carried rather than a gift it celebrated. Nobody volunteered to raise them. Nobody wanted the responsibility of 2 children who would never see a hunting trail or read the warning signs in another wolf's stance. Except Lyra. She had started feeding them in secret months ago, slipping bread and broth to their tiny cabin at the edge of the territory when no one was watching. She had learned to speak to them in soft, patient tones, describing the world in sounds and textures since neither of them would ever see it. Wren liked to be told about colors, even though she would never see one, and Finn liked to be told about distances, how far the river was, how tall the watchtower stood. Now, as the pack turned back to their business, as if a woman's entire life being erased was nothing more than an afternoon's entertainment, the twins clung to Lyra like she was the only solid thing left in the clearing. "Don't go," Wren whispered, her small fingers curling into the fabric of Lyra's skirt. "I'm not going anywhere," Lyra said, crouching down so she was level with both of them. Her voice cracked slightly, the first sign of anything beneath the surface. "Not from you two, not yet." She meant it as comfort. She did not yet know how true those words would become, or how much they would cost her. The pack elders called the gathering to a close, and the crowd began to disperse into smaller groups, murmuring about the confirmed bond, about what this meant for the future of the pack, about whether Celine Marrow would be a fair Luna or a cruel one. Nobody spared a second glance for the rejected Omega walking toward the tree line, with 2 blind children holding onto her hands. Nobody except Cain. He watched her go, something flickering behind his eyes that he quickly buried beneath the mask of duty. Celine noticed the look and slid her arm through his, pulling his attention back toward her with the practiced ease of someone who had learned exactly how to hold a man's focus. "Don't worry about her," Celine said, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "She has nowhere else to go. She'll leave the territory within the week." Cain said nothing. He simply nodded, the way he had learned to nod at everything Celine said since the bond had been confirmed, as though his own opinions had become optional the moment the elders declared them mates. By the time the sun dipped low over the western hills, Lyra had gathered what little belongings she had left: a blanket, a cooking pot, a small wooden box that held letters from her mother, long since passed. She packed them into a canvas sack and looked around the small eastern house that had been her home for 2 years, feeling nothing but a strange, hollow calm. She was not devastated. That surprised her most of all. She had expected grief to swallow her whole, but instead she felt something closer to clarity, as if a fog she had been living inside had finally lifted, revealing a landscape she had never let herself look at directly. She was free. Free of a marriage that had never once made her feel wanted. Free of a man who looked at her the way one looks at a chore finally completed. Free of pretending that the coldness between them was simply the nature of arranged bonds. rather than the plain and simple truth that he had never chosen her. But freedom, she was learning quickly, came with nowhere to sleep. The pack had no formal law against exiling a rejected mate, but there was an unspoken expectation that she would leave the territory entirely, find somewhere else to rebuild a life among strangers who did not know her history. Most rejected Omegas did exactly that. They vanished into neighboring territories, took new names, tried to bury the shame the pack had handed them. Lyra had no intention of vanishing. She walked instead toward the old caretaker's cabin near the northern fence line, a small structure that had once housed the pack's groundskeeper before he passed away without an apprentice to take his place. It had been empty for 3 years, its roof patched with tin, its garden overgrown with wild herbs nobody bothered to harvest. It was, as far as she could tell, the only structure on packland that nobody wanted, which made it perfect. She swept the dust from the single room, patched the largest hole in the roof with scrap wood she found in the shed, and by the time night fell completely, she had a small fire crackling in the stone hearth, and a pot of watery soup bubbling above it. It was not much. It was hers. She thought, that first night, that this would be the whole of her new life, a quiet cabin, a simple existence, the slow work of rebuilding a sense of self that 2 years of marriage had worn thin. She was wrong. Just past midnight, a soft knock sounded at her door, so quiet she almost mistook it for wind. When she opened it, she found Wren and Finn standing on her doorstep, barefoot in the cold, their blind eyes turned up toward the sound of her breathing. "We can't sleep there anymore," Finn said, his small voice trembling. "The new lady said we made too much noise." Lyra's chest tightened. The new lady. Celine had wasted no time asserting her authority, and apparently that authority extended to deciding which children deserved a roof over their heads. She did not hesitate. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "You'll sleep here tonight." That single decision, made in the dark without a second thought, would reshape the rest of her life, in ways she could not yet imagine. She fed them the last of her soup, wrapped them in her only blanket, and sat awake by the fire long after they had fallen asleep, watching their small chests rise and fall, feeling something shift and settle inside her chest. She was no longer simply Lyra Voss' rejected wife. She was, whether the pack acknowledged it or not, the only protector 2 blind children had left in the world. The next morning brought trouble she had not anticipated. A pack enforcer named Owen Bramwell arrived at her door just after sunrise, his expression carefully blank in the way enforcers were trained to hold themselves. "The pups are required at the Eastern nursery for morning lessons," he said. "Orders from the Luna." Luna. Celine had claimed the title before the formal ceremony had even taken place, and nobody in the pack seemed inclined to correct her. "They stayed with me last night because they were turned away from their previous quarters," Lyra said evenly, keeping her voice free of the anger boiling beneath her ribs. "I'll bring them myself." Owen studied her for a long moment, something like sympathy flickering behind his otherwise disciplined expression, before he nodded and left without further argument. Lyra walked the twins to the nursery herself, holding each of their hands, feeling the way their small fingers trembled as they approached the building where the other pack children, all sighted, all whole in the eyes of pack tradition, waited inside. She watched the nursery matron's face twist with something close to distaste as Wren and Finn stepped through the door, their white, unseeing eyes turned toward sounds they could not place. "They'll be fine," the matron said, though her tone suggested she believed the opposite. Lyra crouched down one final time before leaving, cupping Finn's face in her hand. "I'll come back for you both when the sun reaches the top of the sky. Count the warmth on your skin. When it feels strongest, that's when I'll be here." Finn nodded, his blind eyes blinking rapidly, trying to hold back tears that would only mark him as weak in front of the other children. Lyra left the nursery with her jaw tight and her hands curled into fists at her sides, walking back toward the caretaker's cabin, with a resolve she had not felt in years. She had lost her marriage. She had lost her title. She had lost, in the span of a single afternoon, every scrap of status she once held within the pack. But she still had purpose. And as she crossed the clearing where the ceremonial post still stood, the very post that would, in only a matter of days, bear the marks of her own blood, she made herself a quiet promise beneath the morning sky. Whatever came next, whatever punishment the pack tried to hand down to 2 blind children who had never harmed a soul, she would be standing in the way of it. She just did not yet know how soon that promise would be tested. By midday, she returned to the nursery as promised, finding the twins seated together on a bench outside, apart from the other children who played in loud, careless clusters across the yard. Wren's small hand found Lyra's the moment she knelt beside them, gripping tight. Nobody talked to us, Finn said quietly, except to tell us to sit still. Lyra's throat tightened, but she kept her voice light for their sake. Then we'll talk to each other. Tell me what you heard today. Every sound, every voice. Paint the picture for me. And they did, walking hand in hand back toward the cabin, Wren describing the way the wind moved through the training yard fence, Finn describing the rhythm of hammering from the blacksmith's shed, the two of them building a world out of sound, the way other children built worlds out of sight. Lyra listened to every word, storing each detail like a treasure, understanding for the first time in years what it meant to be needed by someone who saw her not as a burden to be released, but as a person worth holding on to. It was a fragile kind of happiness, built on the wreckage of everything the pack had taken from her that morning. But it was happiness all the same, and she intended to protect it with everything she had left. She did not know yet that everything she had left would soon include her own skin. The scream came before the crash. Lyra was 3 steps into the nursery hallway when she heard Wren's cry, high and sharp, followed by the shattering of clay against stone. She ran the rest of the way, her boots skidding on the swept floor, and burst into the ceremonial hall to find the girl frozen in place, her small hands raised in front of her, surrounded by broken pieces of a painted urn that had stood in that corner for generations. Celine stood across the room, her arms crossed, her expression carved from something cold and satisfied. She ruined it, Celine said, loud enough for the gathering enforcers to hear. That urn held the ashes of 3 former Lunas. Do you understand what that pup just destroyed? Wren could not see the shattered pieces at her feet. She had only felt her way along the wall, her fingers brushing against unfamiliar shapes, searching for something solid to hold onto after being startled by a sudden noise behind her. Nobody had warned her the urn stood there. Nobody had ever thought to warn a blind child about anything at all. She didn't know, Lyra said, stepping between Celine and the trembling girl. Nobody told her the room had changed. She was frightened, not careless. The law doesn't care about intention, Celine said, her voice rising, drawing the attention of every enforcer nearby. Disruption of a ceremonial gathering carries a punishment regardless of the reason. You know the rule as well as I do. Lyra did know the rule. Every pack member did. It was an old law, rarely enforced in recent years, meant to preserve discipline among wolves who might otherwise let chaos run unchecked through sacred spaces. It called for a formal correction, administered publicly, as a reminder that respect for pack tradition mattered more than personal excuse. It had never been meant for a 5-year-old who could not even see the danger she walked into. She is a child, Lyra said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling tight in her stomach. A blind child. There is no version of this law that was written with her in mind. The law does not make exceptions for pity, Celine said, and there it was, the flicker of something ugly beneath her composed exterior, something that looked almost like triumph. Enforcers, prepare the post. Wren whimpered, pressing herself against Lyra's legs, her blind eyes wide with a terror she could not properly place, only feel, thick and suffocating in the air around her. Lyra's mind raced through every possible argument, every plea, every appeal to reason that might convince the enforcers to stand down. None of it would work. She could see it already in the set of their shoulders, the resignation in their eyes. They did not want to do this either, but the law was the law, and Celine had invoked it in front of witnesses. There was only one option left. I'll take her place, Lyra said. The words left her mouth before she had fully decided to say them, but the moment they hung in the air she knew she meant every syllable. Celine's eyebrows lifted, genuine surprise flickering across her face for the first time since the confrontation began. You cannot substitute yourself for a pup's punishment. That isn't how the law works. Show me where it says that, Lyra said, holding Celine's gaze without blinking. Show me the exact words that forbid a grown wolf from taking a child's correction upon herself. An older enforcer named Peter Langley cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the confrontation had taken. There's no explicit rule against substitution, he admitted quietly. It's simply never been requested before. Then there's nothing stopping me, Lyra said. Celine's jaw tightened, calculating quickly, weighing the optics of refusing a sacrifice that would make her look needlessly cruel in front of the gathering crowd. If she denied Lyra's offer and punished the child anyway, she risked looking like a Luna who enjoyed hurting the vulnerable. If she accepted the substitution, she got to watch her rival suffer instead, which suited her far better than she was willing to admit out loud. Fine, Celine said, her lips curling into something that resembled a smile but held none of its warmth. The rejected Omega will take the correction meant for the pup. Let this be a lesson to everyone gathered here about the price of disorder. Lyra knelt quickly beside Ren, cupping the girl's face in trembling hands. Go find Finn. Wait for me by the old oak tree at the edge of the clearing. Do not come back here, no matter what you hear. Do you understand? Ren nodded, tears streaming silently down her unseeing eyes, and allowed one of the kinder nursery attendants to lead her out of the hall, her small feet stumbling with every step. The post stood at the center of the training yard, weathered wood worn smooth by decades of use, though it had not been called upon in longer than Lyra could remember. She walked toward it with her spine straight, refusing to let her legs shake even though every part of her wanted to run in the opposite direction. Kane arrived just as the enforcers were binding her wrists to the post, drawn by the murmurs rippling through the gathering crowd. His expression shifted rapidly through confusion, then disbelief, then something far darker as he took in the scene before him. What is the meaning of this? He demanded, striding forward with the authority of an alpha heir who expected immediate answers. Your Luna invoked the disruption law against Ren for breaking the memorial urn, Peter Langley explained, his voice carefully neutral. Lyra volunteered to take the correction in the Pups' place. Kane's eyes found Lyra's across the yard, and for the first time since the rejection ceremony, something raw broke through the careful mask he had been wearing. Untie her, he said. Immediately. The correction has already been sanctioned by the Luna, Celine interjected smoothly, appearing at Kane's side with a hand on his arm. Reversing it now would undermine pack law in front of the entire gathering. Surely you understand the importance of consistency, my love. Kane's jaw worked silently, torn between the authority he was still learning to wield and the instinct screaming at him to intervene. In the end, tradition won, as it so often did within a pack built on centuries of rigid structure. He gave a single, tight nod and stepped back, though his eyes never left Lyra's face. The enforcer assigned to carry out the correction hesitated, his hand trembling slightly around the length of braided leather in his grip. He was young, barely past his own training years, and something in his expression suggested he had never imagined his first assignment would involve punishing a woman for a crime she did not commit. Get on with it, Celine said sharply. The first strike landed, and pain exploded across Lyra's back, sharp and immediate, stealing the breath from her lungs. She bit down hard on her lip, refusing to give Celine the satisfaction of hearing her scream, though tears burned hot and unbidden at the corners of her eyes. She thought of Ren, safe now beneath the old oak tree with her brother, both of them spared from a pain neither had deserved to feel. She thought of the promise she had made to herself only the night before, standing in that same clearing, vowing to stand in the way of whatever punishment the pack tried to hand down to those children. The second strike came, and the third, and somewhere around the fourth, her knees finally buckled, dropping her weight against the ropes binding her wrists to the post. Kane's hands were suddenly on her shoulders, having crossed the distance between them in a blur of motion nobody had authorized. That's enough, he said, his voice carrying an authority that finally overrode Celine's earlier command. The correction is complete. The young enforcer stepped back immediately, relief flooding his features, clearly grateful for an excuse to stop. Celine's mouth opened as if to argue, then closed again, as she registered the shift in the gathered crowd's mood, the way sympathy had begun to outweigh judgment among the onlookers. Kane cut the ropes himself, catching Lyra before she collapsed fully to the ground, his arms wrapping around her in a way that felt achingly familiar despite everything that had changed between them. Why? He asked quietly, his voice rough with something she could not quite name. Why would you take this for them? Lyra lifted her head, meeting his eyes through the haze of pain clouding her vision. Because nobody else would, she said simply. It was the truest thing she had said all day, and the weight of it settled heavily in the space between them, unspoken questions hanging thick in the cooling afternoon air. Word of what had happened spread through the pack faster than any formal announcement could have managed. By evening, whispers followed Lyra everywhere she walked, some tinged with pity, others with a grudging respect nobody had expected to feel for a rejected Omega. Celine, for her part, retreated to her chambers in a mood that servants described as thunderous, furious that her display of authority had somehow transformed into a story of Lyra's quiet strength instead. That night, as Lyra lay on her stomach in the caretaker's cabin, her back wrapped in salve-soaked cloth by an elderly healer named Grace who had come without being asked, Ren and Finn curled up on either side of her, careful not to touch the wounds but unwilling to sleep anywhere else. Does it hurt? Finn whispered into the darkness. Not as much as watching either of you hurt would have, Lyra whispered back, and meant every word. Outside, beneath the same old oak tree where the twins had waited that afternoon, Kane stood alone in the darkness, staring toward the small cabin at the edge of packland, wrestling with a question he was not yet ready to answer. He did not yet understand what was happening inside him. He only knew that something had shifted the moment he watched Lyra take a punishment meant for a child who was not even hers, and he suspected, with a growing unease he could not shake, that this would not be the last time. The healer's hands trembled as she pressed a fresh cloth against the wound on Lyra's shoulder, and this time, the wound had come from something far more deliberate than a moment of childish panic. 3 days had passed since the whipping post, and Lyra's back had barely begun to heal when the second incident occurred, this one carrying none of the accidental innocence of the first. It happened during the twins' training session, a mandatory exercise meant to teach young pups basic pack discipline through simple physical drills. Blind or not, pack law required every child to attend, though nobody had ever bothered adjusting the exercises to account for eyes that could not see the obstacles laid out across the yard. Celine had personally overseen the session that morning, something she had never done before, and something that immediately raised the hairs on the back of Lyra's neck when she heard about it secondhand from Grace, the elderly healer who seemed to have appointed herself an unofficial informant in Lyra's corner. She rearranged the obstacle course, Grace said, her weathered hands folding a fresh bandage with practiced efficiency, moved the training poles closer together than usual, right where the twins would be running the drill, called it randomized difficulty, said it built character. Lyra's stomach twisted with a dread she recognized immediately. She wanted them to fall. I believe so, Grace admitted quietly, and I believe she knew exactly how hard that ground had been packed the night before, after all that rain froze it solid. By the time Lyra reached the training yard, the damage had already been done. Finn sat on the ground clutching his knee, his face pale with pain, while an enforcer hovered nearby looking uncertain about how to proceed. Wren stood frozen a few feet away, her hands outstretched, feeling for obstacles that had shifted without warning since the last time she had memorized their positions. What happened here? Lyra demanded, crossing the yard in quick strides. Training accident, Celine said smoothly, appearing from the shadow of the equipment shed as though she had been waiting for precisely this moment. The pup misjudged his footing. These things happen during proper discipline exercises. You moved the poles, Lyra said, her voice low and dangerous in a way she had never allowed herself to sound before. You moved them specifically into a pattern they hadn't memorized, on ground you knew had frozen overnight. Careful, Celine said, her eyes narrowing. Accusing your Luna of deliberate harm against pack children is a serious offense, one that carries its own consequences. Lyra swallowed the fury rising hot in her throat, understanding immediately that any accusation she made without proof would only give Celine another excuse to punish someone, and this time, there might not be a chance to intervene before real damage was done. She knelt instead beside Finn, examining his knee with careful hands, relieved to find swelling but no obvious break. Can you walk? She asked gently. Finn nodded through gritted teeth, though his face remained pale with the effort of holding back tears in front of the watching enforcers. Then we're done here, Lyra said, helping him to his feet, gathering Wren's hand into her own as she guided both children away from the training yard, away from Celine's satisfied expression, away from a situation that had nearly turned into something far worse than a twisted knee. She did not know, walking back toward the cabin with the twins limping beside her, that Celine had merely been testing the waters, gauging how far she could push before facing real consequence. The true test would come only 2 days later, and this time, there would be no walking away unscathed. It began with an invitation that was not really an invitation at all. A formal summons arrived at the caretaker's cabin, delivered by an enforcer Lyra did not recognize, requesting her presence at a private training assessment for the twins, to be held that afternoon in the eastern courtyard. The wording was polite. The undertone was anything but. Lyra arrived to find Celine waiting alone, no other enforcers or pack members in sight, a fact that immediately set every instinct in Lyra's body on high alert. I've decided the twins need advanced sensory training, Celine announced, gesturing toward a series of ropes strung between wooden posts, forming a narrow, elevated pathway several feet off the ground. Blind pups must learn to compensate for their disability through heightened balance and awareness. This exercise will help develop those skills. Lyra's eyes traced the rope pathway, noting immediately how high it stood, how thin the ropes appeared, how absolutely nothing about the setup resembled any legitimate training exercise she had ever witnessed within the pack. They're 5 years old, Lyra said carefully, and they cannot see the ropes to balance on them. Which is precisely the point, Celine said, her smile sharp and thin. Blindness is not an excuse for weakness. If they cannot learn to navigate the world without sight, They will remain a burden on this pack forever. I'm simply accelerating a lesson they would need to learn eventually. This isn't training, Lyra said, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain composed. This is cruelty dressed up as discipline. Any pup would struggle on that course, sighted or not. Are you questioning your Luna's judgment? Celine asked, her tone deceptively soft, though the threat beneath it rang clear as a struck bell. Lyra looked past her toward the twins, who stood nearby holding hands, their small faces turned toward the sound of the conversation, clearly aware that something dangerous was being decided about their immediate future. She made her decision in an instant, the same way she had made it 3 days earlier at the whipping post. I'll demonstrate the course first, Lyra said, to ensure it's safe before either of them attempts it. Celine's eyes flickered with something that looked almost like disappointment, as though she had hoped Lyra would simply refuse and give her an excuse to punish the twins directly instead. Very well, she said, gesturing toward the rope pathway. Show us how it's done. Lyra climbed the small wooden platform at the start of the course, her injured back protesting the movement, her palms already sweating despite the cool afternoon air. The ropes stretched before her, thin and swaying gently with the breeze, suspended over ground that had been deliberately left uneven and rocky beneath the platform's edge. She stepped onto the first rope, feeling it dip and sway under her weight, and forced herself to keep moving, one careful step at a time, arms outstretched for balance. She made it 3 steps before the rope beneath her right foot twisted unexpectedly, and she felt her balance tip too far to recover. She fell. The ground rushed up faster than she expected, and she twisted her body instinctively at the last moment, taking the impact across her shoulder and forearm rather than her head, a decision that likely saved her from far worse injury, but still sent a sharp crack of pain radiating up through her arm the moment she hit the rocky ground. For a moment, the world went white with agony. Then hands were on her, gentle but urgent, and she blinked her vision back into focus to find Ren and Finn kneeling beside her, their small faces streaked with tears, feeling frantically along her arms and shoulders to assess the damage they could not see. She's not moving right, Finn said, his voice cracking with panic. Her arm feels wrong. It did feel wrong. Lyra could tell without needing a healer to confirm it, the strange, unnatural angle of her forearm sending waves of nausea through her stomach every time she tried to shift position. Celine stood over the scene with an expression that betrayed nothing beyond mild inconvenience, as though watching someone break their arm on her deliberately dangerous course was merely an unfortunate delay in her afternoon schedule. Well, Celine said finally, I suppose that settles the matter. The course is clearly too advanced for the pups, given even a grown wolf struggled to complete it. We'll postpone their sensory training for now. She turned and walked away without offering assistance, without calling for a healer, without acknowledging in any way that her carefully engineered accident had just resulted in a broken bone. It was Peter Langley, the older enforcer who had witnessed the whipping post incident days earlier, who happened upon the scene moments later, drawn by the twins' distressed cries carrying across the courtyard. He took one look at the unnatural angle of Lyra's arm and immediately summoned Grace, the healer, along with 2 younger enforcers to help carry Lyra back toward her cabin. This wasn't an accident, Peter said quietly to Grace as they walked, glancing back toward the rope course still swaying gently in the breeze behind them. I've seen that course before, back when it was used for advanced warrior training. It was never meant for children, and it was certainly never meant to be attempted without proper safety lines. Grace's mouth pressed into a thin line, understanding fully what Peter was suggesting without needing him to say it outright. Someone needs to say something to the Alpha Heir about this, she said, before someone gets seriously hurt. And risk his wrath falling on us instead of her, Peter said grimly. You've seen how devoted he's become to protecting his mate's reputation, even when the evidence points against her. Back at the cabin, Grace set Lyra's arm with careful, practiced hands, wrapping it tightly in a splint fashioned from smooth wood and cloth strips, while Lyra bit down hard on a folded rag to keep from crying out at the pain of the bones being properly aligned. You need to stop doing this, Grace said quietly, once the worst of the procedure had passed, her weathered eyes filled with something between admiration and genuine worry. Whatever is driving you to keep placing yourself between those children, and every danger this pack throws their way, it's going to get you killed eventually, not just injured. Lyra stared at the ceiling of the small cabin, exhaustion and pain making her voice quieter than she intended. What choice do I have? Nobody else steps forward. Nobody else even seems to notice what's happening to them. That's not entirely true, Grace said, glancing meaningfully toward the door, where the shadow of a familiar figure had lingered outside for several minutes without entering, unsure of his welcome. Someone's been noticing plenty. Lyra turned her head just enough to see Kane standing in the doorway, his expression a complicated mixture of guilt, anger, and something else entirely that he had not yet learned how to name, even to himself. Kane did not step into the cabin right away. He stood in the doorway with his hand braced against the frame, his eyes fixed on the splint wrapped around Lyra's forearm, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, as though the sight of her injury had stolen every word he had rehearsed on his way there. Grace gathered her supplies quickly, sensing the shift in the room, and slipped past Kane with a knowing glance that suggested she had seen this particular tension building for longer than either of them realized. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving the two of them alone with the fire crackling softly in the hearth, and the twins asleep in the corner bed, worn out from the fear and grief of the afternoon. "Tell me what happened," Kane said finally, moving to sit on the wooden stool beside her bed, his large frame folding into a space clearly not built for someone his size. "You already know what happened," Lyra said, too tired to soften her words. "Your Luna built a training course designed to injure children, and when I demonstrated it first to protect them, I fell instead. Celine said the course collapsed unexpectedly, an accident. Then Celine lied to you," Lyra said flatly, meeting his eyes without flinching. "Ask Peter Langley. Ask anyone who witnessed it. That course was never meant for children in the first place. It was warrior training equipment, repurposed and left without safety measures, specifically so that whoever attempted it would fall." Kane's jaw tightened, and something dark passed behind his eyes, though whether it was anger at Celine or frustration at himself for not investigating sooner, Lyra could not tell. "Why do you keep doing this?" he asked again, the same question he had asked her 3 days earlier at the whipping post, still unanswered in any way that satisfied him. "You have no obligation to those pups. They are not your blood. They are not your responsibility. You could leave this territory entirely and start a new life somewhere the pack's judgment couldn't follow you." Lyra was quiet for a long moment, staring at the fire rather than at him, choosing her words carefully. "Do you remember the day their parents died?" she asked eventually. Kane's expression flickered with surprise at the sudden shift in direction, but he nodded slowly. "During the raid, I remember. I was the one who found them," Lyra said, her voice growing distant, pulled back into a memory she rarely allowed herself to revisit. 2 babies, barely a year old, crying beside their mother's body because nobody else had come looking yet. Everyone else was too busy counting losses among the warriors, tallying which territories had been breached, which supplies had been destroyed. Nobody thought to search for survivors among the fallen until I heard the crying myself. She paused, swallowing against the tightness in her throat. I held them both that entire night, waiting for someone to come tell me what to do with 2 orphaned pups nobody wanted. Nobody came, so I fed them myself, from supplies I had no business taking, and I kept coming back every day after that, even after my marriage began, even after I was told repeatedly that caring for blind pups was beneath someone married to the future alpha. Kane's hands curled into fists against his knees, something bitter twisting through his chest as he listened. "I never knew any of this." "Because you never asked," Lyra said simply. No bitterness in her voice, only exhausted honesty. "You were never cruel to me, Kane. I want you to know that much. But you were never curious about me either. Not about what I did with my days, not about where my loyalty settled, not about anything beyond the role I was expected to fill as your wife." The words landed heavier than any physical blow could have, and Kane sat with them in silence, feeling the truth of them settle uncomfortably against everything he thought he understood about the last 2 years of his life. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "I don't need your apology," Lyra said. "I need you to see what's actually happening in your own pack, under your own mate's authority. 2 blind children are being deliberately harmed, repeatedly, by a woman you're bonded to defend. That's not a personal matter between us anymore, Kane. That's a matter of pack justice." Kane was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire the same way Lyra had moments before, wrestling with a truth he had been avoiding since the moment the bond with Celine had been confirmed. "The bond felt wrong from the beginning," he admitted quietly, as though confessing something forbidden. "I told myself it was simply the shock of destiny arriving all at once. Every wolf describes the true mate bond as overwhelming, consuming, impossible to resist. I assumed the wrongness I felt was fear, not instinct warning me away from something dangerous. And now?" Lyra asked. "Now I'm not certain what I felt was a true bond at all," Kane said, his brow furrowing with the weight of a suspicion he had not allowed himself to voice until this moment. "I've read about false bonds before, artificial connections created through certain forbidden methods. I never imagined I would need to consider the possibility seriously. Not until watching what Celine has done to two innocent children, and how easily she lied to my face about it afterward. Lyra said nothing, letting him work through the realization on his own, understanding that pushing him toward a conclusion he was not ready to accept would only make him defensive. I need proof, Kane said finally, standing from the stool with new determination hardening his expression. If the bond is false, there will be evidence somewhere. Elixirs strong enough to fabricate a mate connection require rare ingredients, expensive enough that whoever provided them would remember the transaction. Be careful, Lyra said, a flicker of genuine concern crossing her face, despite everything that had happened between them. If Celine realizes you're investigating her, she'll retaliate, and she has already shown exactly how far she's willing to go against children who cannot even see her coming. I know, Kane said quietly, pausing at the door to look back at her one final time. Which is why I need you to be careful as well. Whatever protection I can offer you and the twins right now is limited, at least until I have proof strong enough to challenge a confirmed bond in front of the pack elders. Until then, please, stop putting yourself directly in harm's way. I can't promise that, Lyra said honestly. Kane's expression tightened with something that looked almost like fear, though he said nothing further before slipping out into the darkness, leaving Lyra alone with the fire and the soft, steady breathing of two sleeping children, who had already lost so much and stood to lose so much more if the coming days did not unfold the way she desperately hoped they would. Elder Marin visited the following morning, arriving unannounced at the cabin door with a basket of fresh bread and an expression that suggested she had come for reasons beyond simple charity. You've been busy, Marin said, settling herself onto the single wooden chair without waiting for an invitation, her sharp eyes taking in the splint on Lyra's arm, the healing marks still visible along her back where her shirt gapped slightly at the collar. I've been trying to survive, Lyra said carefully, unsure how much trust she could place in an elder whose loyalties within the pack remained unclear to her. There's an old prophecy, Marin said, ignoring the deflection entirely, her weathered fingers tracing idle patterns against the basket in her lap. Passed down through generations of pack elders, rarely spoken aloud, because most dismiss it as superstition rather than genuine foresight. It speaks of a discarded shield, a protector cast aside by the very pack she serves, who rises to guard what others refuse to value. Lyra's breath caught slightly, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. That sounds like a story told to comfort the powerless. Perhaps, Marin said, her sharp eyes meeting Lyra's directly. Or perhaps it's simply a pattern that repeats itself throughout history, wearing different faces in different generations, waiting for the right circumstances to reveal itself again. Why are you telling me this? Lyra asked. Marin smiled, an expression that held more knowledge than warmth. Because I've watched 3 punishments fall upon those children in the span of a single week, and I've watched you intercept every single one of them, at increasing cost to your own body. That is not coincidence, child. That is pattern. And pattern, in a pack as old as ours, tends to mean something larger is unfolding than any of us yet understand. She rose from the chair before Lyra could formulate a response, leaving the basket of bread on the small table beside the door. Rest while you can, Marin said, pausing at the threshold. Something tells me the coming days will demand far more from you than the ones that have already passed. She left without further explanation, her words settling over Lyra like a weight she could not quite name, heavy with implication, and uncertain of what exactly waited on the other side of the days Marin had warned her to prepare for. The knife came down hard against the cutting board, and Celine smiled at the sound, imagining a very different kind of blade entirely. 3 days had passed since the rope course incident, and word had spread through the pack that Lyra's broken arm had come from something other than a simple accident. Whispers followed Celine now wherever she walked, quieter than they had ever dared before, but present all the same, and she despised every syllable of them. She sat in her private chambers, a goblet of wine untouched beside her, mind churning through possibilities for how to reclaim the narrative that had begun slipping from her grasp. The rejected Omega had somehow transformed, in the eyes of the pack, from a discarded wife into something resembling a martyr, and martyrs, Celine understood well, had a dangerous way of becoming symbols too powerful to simply dismiss. She needed to end this before it grew any further. The opportunity presented itself 2 days later, disguised as an innocent request from the pack elders for a demonstration of loyalty among the younger pack members, a tradition meant to reaffirm bonds of trust before the upcoming seasonal gathering. Celine twisted the tradition to her own purposes with practiced ease, proposing a public test that would, on the surface, appear entirely reasonable to anyone unfamiliar with her true intentions. The twins will be tested for their obedience, Celine announced during a pack council meeting. her voice carrying the false warmth of someone genuinely concerned for tradition. A simple exercise, conducted before witnesses, to demonstrate that even pups without sight can learn proper pack discipline. Kane's eyes narrowed slightly at the proposal, suspicion evident in the tight line of his jaw, though he said nothing yet, waiting to see exactly what trap Celine had constructed this time. "What does this test involve?" Elder Marin asked, her sharp gaze fixed on Celine with an intensity that suggested she too sensed something calculated beneath the proposal's innocent framing. "A simple command exercise," Celine said smoothly. "The pups will be instructed to remain perfectly still in the center of the training yard, regardless of distractions or provocations, for a period of 10 minutes. Success demonstrates discipline. Failure demonstrates the need for further correction." The council murmured amongst themselves, several elders nodding at what appeared, on its surface, to be a reasonable enough exercise. Only Kane and Marin seemed to sense the deeper current running beneath Celine's carefully worded proposal. "And what qualifies as a distraction?" Kane asked carefully. "Nothing more than typical pack activity happening around them," Celine said, waving a dismissive hand. "Nothing dangerous, simply a test of focus and obedience." The council approved the exercise, scheduled for the following afternoon, and Celine left the meeting with a satisfaction she could barely contain, already planning exactly what kind of distractions she intended to arrange. Lyra learned of the test that evening, delivered through Peter Langley's quiet visit to the cabin, his expression grim with warning. "I don't trust it," Peter admitted, standing just inside the doorway, his eyes flicking toward the twins playing quietly by the fire, unaware of the conversation happening in hushed tones nearby. "Celine has requested specific animals be brought to the training yard tomorrow, animals known for aggressive behavior when provoked." Lyra's blood ran cold. "What kind of animals?" "Trained hunting hounds," Peter said quietly. "The same breed used to track wounded prey during hunts. They're not typically aggressive toward pack members, but they can be provoked into snapping if handled roughly, or if their training commands are deliberately confused." "She intends to frighten them into moving," Lyra said, understanding immediately what Celine planned. "And when they flinch or cry out, she'll claim they failed the discipline test." "That's my suspicion as well," Peter said grimly, "though proving intent beforehand will be difficult. She's careful enough to make everything appear like unfortunate coincidence." Lyra spent that night unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling of the small cabin, while the twins slept peacefully nearby, unaware of the danger waiting for them the following afternoon. She turned over every possible option in her mind, searching for some way to protect them without directly defying a sanctioned pack exercise, understanding that outright refusal would only give Celine grounds to punish all three of them severely. By morning, she had made her decision. The training yard was crowded by early afternoon, pack members gathering from every corner of the territory, drawn by curiosity about the unusual discipline exercise being conducted so publicly. Ren and Finn stood at the center of the yard, small and vulnerable amid the growing crowd, their blind eyes turned toward the murmur of voices surrounding them, unable to see the hounds being led into position at the yard's perimeter. Lyra positioned herself as close to the twins as the enforcers would allow, close enough to intervene the moment things went wrong, though not so close that Celine could accuse her of interfering with a sanctioned exercise before it had even begun. Kane stood near the council elders, his expression carved from stone, watching the proceedings with an intensity that suggested he was searching desperately for a legitimate reason to halt everything before it started. "Begin," Celine announced, her voice ringing clear across the training yard. The twins stood perfectly still at first, their small hands clasped together, their heads tilted slightly as they listened to the growing murmur of the crowd around them. The hounds remained at a distance initially, held by handlers who seemed uncertain about the true purpose of their presence. Then, subtly, at a signal from Celine that only her most loyal enforcers seemed to notice, the hound handlers began moving their animals closer, allowing the leashes to slacken just enough that the dog's excited barking grew louder, sharper, closer to the twins than any legitimate training exercise should have permitted. Ren flinched first, her small body curling instinctively at the sudden proximity of aggressive barking, her hands flying up to cover her ears against sounds she could not place or understand. Finn grabbed for his sister's arm, trying to steady her, trying to hold his own ground despite the fear clearly building in his small chest. "They're moving," Celine called out sharply, her voice carrying triumphant satisfaction. "The exercise requires perfect stillness. This constitutes failure." "They flinched because you deliberately provoked aggressive animals into their space," Lyra shouted back, stepping forward despite the enforcers attempting to hold the crowd's boundary. "This was never a fair test." "The council approved this exercise," Celine said coldly, "and the terms were clear. Perfect stillness, regardless of distraction. These pups have failed, and failure carries consequence. She gestured toward two enforcers standing near a wooden frame at the yard's edge. Equipment Lyra recognized immediately with a fresh surge of horror. It was not the whipping post from before. This was something crueler, a device meant to restrain limbs at painful angles for extended periods, a punishment more psychological than physical, designed to break a person's spirit through prolonged discomfort rather than swift pain. No, Lyra said, crossing the remaining distance in quick strides, placing herself bodily between the twins and the approaching enforcers. I'll take their place again. Whatever punishment you've prepared, direct it at me instead. Celine's expression shifted, something calculating flickering behind her eyes as she considered this offer with renewed interest. You continue to insert yourself into matters that don't concern you. At what point does the pack begin questioning your own obedience, given how frequently you defy sanctioned discipline in favor of protecting children who aren't your own? Then question it, Lyra said, refusing to back down despite the danger clearly building around her. Punish me for defiance if you must, but you will not touch these children again. The crowd had grown utterly silent, every pack member present holding their breath as the confrontation reached its peak, sensing that something larger than a simple discipline exercise was unfolding before them. Very well, Celine said finally, her voice carrying across the silent yard. If the rejected Omega wishes to claim every punishment meant for these pups as her own, then let her demonstrate exactly how much she's willing to sacrifice. Restrain her instead. The enforcers hesitated, glancing toward Kane for confirmation before proceeding, uncertain about carrying out an order that seemed increasingly extreme, even by the pack's traditional standards. Do it, Celine snapped, when nobody moved immediately. Or face insubordination charges yourselves. Reluctantly, the enforcers moved forward, and Lyra allowed herself to be led toward the restraining frame, her arms already trembling with exhaustion from the accumulated toll of the past week's injuries, understanding fully that this punishment would push her body further than it had already been pushed, perhaps further than it could safely withstand. As they secured her limbs into position, she caught Kane's eye across the yard, and something passed between them in that single glance, an understanding neither of them had words for yet, but both of them felt with absolute certainty. This could not continue. Something had to break, and soon, before it broke her entirely. Her shoulders screamed before the first hour had even passed. The restraining frame held her arms stretched wide and slightly upward, her wrists bound at an angle that sent constant, grinding pain through joints already weakened by her broken forearm, still healing beneath its splint. She had been warned that this punishment was designed to wear down endurance rather than deliver a single sharp blow, and now she understood exactly what that meant, feeling every minute stretch longer than the one before it. The crowd had mostly dispersed after the first hour, growing bored with a punishment that offered no dramatic climax, only the slow, grinding sight of a woman enduring pain in silence. Only a handful of pack members remained, along with the enforcers assigned to oversee the sentence, and Kane, who had not moved from his position near the yard's edge since the moment the restraints had been secured. Ren and Finn had been ushered away by Grace, the healer, who had taken one look at the unfolding scene and decided, without asking anyone's permission, that two blind children had no business witnessing this particular punishment stretch into its second and third hours. It was well past sunset when Celine finally arrived to end it, drawn perhaps by simple boredom, or perhaps by a need to witness the results of her own cruelty firsthand. Release her, Celine said, waving a dismissive hand toward the enforcers, as though the entire ordeal had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience finally reaching its natural conclusion. Lyra's legs buckled the moment her wrists were freed, and only Kane's quick movement across the yard prevented her from collapsing fully onto the packed earth beneath her. He caught her against his chest, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all, the silence between them heavier than any words could have carried. I need to get her to the healer, Kane said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury directed entirely at his own mate. Of course, Celine said smoothly, though something flickered behind her eyes that suggested she had not expected quite this level of reaction from him. I trust the lesson has been sufficiently learned. Kane did not respond. He simply lifted Lyra carefully into his arms, ignoring the murmurs of surprise rippling through the remaining onlookers, and carried her away from the training yard without another word spoken toward his mate. Grace's small healing hut, tucked near the eastern edge of the pack territory, smelled of dried herbs and burning sage, a comforting contrast to the harsh, punishing air of the training yard Lyra had just left behind. Kane laid her carefully onto a cot near the fire, and Grace immediately began working, her weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency over Lyra's swollen shoulders and wrists. "She needs rest," Grace said firmly, glancing up at Kane with an expression that held no patience for excuses. Real rest, not the constant threat hanging over her head every single day since her rejection. Her body cannot continue absorbing punishment meant for children indefinitely, no matter how noble her intentions. "I know," Kane said quietly, guilt etched deep into every line of his face. Grace finished her ministrations and stepped outside to gather fresh water, leaving the two of them alone in the flickering firelight, the tension between them thick enough to feel almost physical. "I found something today," Kane said finally, breaking the silence that had settled over the small hut. "While you were being punished for a crime you didn't commit, I was investigating the very question I raised with you days ago." Lyra turned her head slightly, wincing at the movement, but her eyes found his with unmistakable interest despite her exhaustion. "What did you find?" "A traitor," Kane said, his jaw tightening with barely restrained anger. "Someone who deals in rare herbs and forbidden concoctions, operating on the outskirts of neighboring territories." He confirmed, under considerable pressure, that Celine purchased a substance from him roughly 2 weeks before the bond ceremony. A substance known specifically for artificially triggering false mate recognition in unsuspecting wolves. Lyra's breath caught. "She manufactured the bond." "It appears so," Kane said, his voice low and dangerous in a way she had never heard from him before. "Which means everything since that ceremony, every claim she's made to authority as my Luna, has been built on a foundation of deliberate deception." "Do you have proof strong enough to present before the elders?" Lyra asked, pushing herself carefully into a sitting position despite the protest of her aching muscles. "The traitor has agreed to testify, in exchange for leniency regarding his own illegal activities," Kane said. "It won't be enough on its own, but combined with a formal bond examination performed by the pack's spiritual healer, it should be sufficient to expose the fabrication publicly." "And once exposed," Lyra asked carefully, "what happens to her?" "Manufacturing a false mate bond through forbidden means is considered one of the gravest violations within pack law," Kane said grimly. "The punishment is exile, at minimum. Given the additional harm she's inflicted on innocent children during her false claim to authority, the elders may consider something far harsher." Lyra was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he had just revealed, understanding the magnitude of what was about to unfold within the pack's structure. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked finally. "You could have kept this investigation private until you were ready to act. Why share it with me now, in the middle of my own recovery?" Kane's expression softened, something vulnerable breaking through the careful composure he had maintained since the moment they met in that clearing days ago. "Because you deserve to know the truth before anyone else. Because everything Celine has done to you, and to those children, exists as a direct result of a lie I unknowingly helped enforce, simply by trusting a bond that was never genuine to begin with." "You couldn't have known," Lyra said quietly. "I could have asked more questions," Kane said, guilt heavy in every word. "I could have noticed how wrong the bond felt from the very beginning, instead of dismissing my own instincts as fear. I could have protected you from a rejection that should never have happened in the first place, had I trusted myself rather than a manufactured destiny." Lyra studied his face carefully in the flickering firelight, searching for any trace of manipulation or false sincerity, finding only genuine remorse staring back at her. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now I gather enough evidence to bring formal charges before the full council," Kane said, determination replacing the guilt in his voice. "And I need your help doing it, if you're willing to give it. Your testimony about the pattern of harm inflicted on the twins will matter significantly when the elders weigh the severity of Celine's punishment." "I'll testify," Lyra said without hesitation, "whatever it takes to ensure those children are finally safe from her." Something shifted in Kane's expression at her words, a warmth spreading through features that had carried nothing but cold duty since the day of the rejection ceremony. He reached out slowly, as though unsure whether the gesture would be welcomed, and gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face. "I don't deserve your help," he said quietly. "Not after everything I allowed to happen to you." "I'm not helping you," Lyra said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion still weighing heavy on her body. "I'm helping them. Whatever happens between us afterward is a separate matter entirely." Kane nodded slowly, accepting the distinction without argument, though something in his eyes suggested he hoped, quietly and perhaps against his better judgment, that the two matters might not remain as separate as she claimed. Outside the healing hut, the first stars had begun appearing across the darkening sky, indifferent to the quiet reckoning building within the pack below, unaware that the coming days would reshape everything the territory had come to understand about power, loyalty, and the true cost of cruelty disguised as tradition. Wren's small fingers found the edge of the blanket and pulled it tighter around her shoulders, though the cabin was warm enough that the gesture had nothing to do with cold. 3 days had passed since the restraining frame, and Lyra's body had finally begun to recover enough that she could sit upright without wincing at every small movement. The twins had barely left her side since Grace allowed her to return home, taking turns reading to her from books they could not see, describing the pictures on each page based purely on the texture of the paper beneath their fingertips, a game they had invented together long before this entire ordeal began. "Tell us again about the wall," Finn said one evening, settling himself against Lyra's uninjured side while his sister curled up on her other flank. "Which wall?" Lyra asked, smiling despite the ache still lingering in her shoulders. "The one that isn't really a wall," Finn said, grinning with the particular delight of a child who loved a familiar story precisely because he already knew how it ended. "The Alpha Wall." Lyra laughed softly, the sound surprising her almost as much as it seemed to surprise the twins, who had rarely heard genuine laughter from her since the rejection ceremony weeks earlier. "There's no such thing as an alpha wall, silly." "But he stands so still," Wren said seriously, her blind eyes turned up toward the sound of Lyra's voice. "Like a wall. We hear him breathing sometimes, near the cabin at night. He doesn't come in. He just stands there, like he's guarding something." Lyra's breath caught slightly at the observation, realizing the twins had noticed Kane's nightly vigils outside the cabin, far more acutely than she had given them credit for. She had assumed, perhaps naively, that his presence had gone unnoticed by children who could not see him standing there. "He's been worried about us," Lyra said carefully. "That's all." "Do you like him?" Finn asked, with the blunt honesty only a 5-year-old could manage without embarrassment. Lyra hesitated, unsure how to answer a question she had not fully allowed herself to examine, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. "It's complicated," she said finally. "Grown-up things are always complicated," Wren said with a dramatic sigh that suggested she had heard this particular phrase used as a deflection many times before, and found it thoroughly unsatisfying as an answer. Lyra smiled, pulling both children closer against her sides, grateful beyond words for the simple, uncomplicated love they offered her without condition or expectation. Whatever chaos swirled through the pack's political structure, whatever reckoning approached with Celine's exposure looming on the horizon, these two small souls had become the truest, steadiest source of comfort in her entire life. "I know you two understand things differently than most people," Lyra said quietly, brushing her fingers gently through Wren's hair. "You can't see faces, or colors, or the way someone's expression shifts when they're lying versus telling the truth. But I think, in some ways, that means you understand people more clearly than anyone else in this pack." "What do you mean?" Finn asked, tilting his head with genuine curiosity. "You listen to voices," Lyra said. "To the way someone breathes when they're afraid, or the way their footsteps change when they're trying to hide something. You've learned to read the world through senses most people never bother developing because they rely too heavily on what they can simply look at." Wren considered this for a long moment, her small face thoughtful in the firelight. "Celine's voice sounds like broken glass," she said finally, her tone matter-of-fact rather than dramatic. "Sharp, even when she's trying to sound soft." "And yours sounds like warm bread," Finn added, snuggling closer against Lyra's side. "Even when you're hurting, even when your voice shakes a little bit, underneath." Lyra felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the simple, unguarded honesty of children, who had no reason to flatter her, no political motivation for their observations, only the pure, uncomplicated truth of what they perceived through senses sharper than most people ever developed. "We know what you've been doing for us," Wren said quietly, her small hand finding Lyra's uninjured arm and gripping it tightly. "Every time. The whipping post, the rope course, the frame in the training yard. We know you took all of that so we wouldn't have to." Lyra's throat tightened painfully, unable to speak for a long moment as she processed the fact that the twins understood far more about what had happened over the past weeks than she had ever intended for them to grasp. "We're not supposed to know," Finn added, his voice small and uncertain. "Grace told the other healers not to talk about it in front of us, but we heard things, the way people whispered when we walked past, the way our names got mentioned, and then yours right afterward, every single time. I never wanted you to carry the weight of that knowledge," Lyra said finally, her voice thick with emotion she could no longer contain. "You're children. You shouldn't have to understand sacrifice, or cruelty, or the way this pack has treated you unfairly since the day you were born. But we do understand it," Wren said, with a wisdom that felt far older than her 5 years. "And we wanted you to know that we understand something else too." What's that? Lyra asked softly. That nobody has ever loved us the way you do, Finn said simply, his small hand reaching up to touch Lyra's cheek, his blind fingers tracing the shape of tears she had not realized were falling. Not our parents, because we don't remember them. Not the nursery matron, because she's always afraid of us. Not the pack, because they think we're bad luck. You're the only one, Ren finished quietly, who ever made us feel like we were worth protecting. Lyra pulled both children into her arms fully then, ignoring the ache in her healing shoulders, holding them against her chest as the first genuine tears she had allowed herself since the rejection ceremony finally broke free, streaming silently down her face in the flickering firelight. She had told herself, throughout every punishment she had endured over the past weeks, that she was protecting them out of simple moral obligation, out of the memory of finding them orphaned and crying on a battlefield nobody else had bothered to search. But sitting there in that small cabin, holding two children who had just articulated something she had never allowed herself to fully acknowledge, she understood the deeper truth beneath all of it. She loved them. Not out of obligation, not out of guilt over a battlefield she happened to search more thoroughly than anyone else, but with the same fierce, unconditional love that any mother felt for children born of her own body. Somewhere over the past year of secret feedings and whispered stories, these two blind pups had become hers in every way that mattered, regardless of blood or pack law or the tangled political mess unfolding around them. I love you both, she said quietly, the words feeling more solid and certain than anything she had spoken in longer than she could remember. More than I ever thought possible. Whatever happens next, with the pack, with Celine, with everything still unfolding around us, that will never change. Even if the pack still doesn't want us, Ren asked in a small voice. Especially then, Lyra said fiercely, holding them tighter still. Because pack or no pack, title or no title, you are mine. And I will spend every remaining day of my life making sure you both understand exactly how loved you truly are. Outside the small cabin, unseen by any of them in that quiet, tender moment, Kane stood once again in his nightly vigil beneath the darkening sky, having overheard every word through the thin wooden walls, his own eyes wet with emotion he had not expected to feel so powerfully. He had come each night intending simply to ensure their safety from a distance, uncertain of his welcome after everything his own blindness to Celine's manipulation had cost this small, unconventional family. But standing there now, listening to Lyra's fierce declaration of love for two children the entire pack had discarded as worthless, something settled firmly into place within his own heart, a certainty he had been circling for weeks without quite landing on its true shape. He wanted this. Not the political advantage of exposing Celine's false bond, not simply the restoration of order within his pack structure, but this specific, imperfect, deeply loving family that had formed itself entirely without his help, built from nothing but Lyra's stubborn refusal to let two innocent children go unprotected. He wanted to be part of it, if they would ever allow him back in. The following morning brought news that would accelerate everything far faster than any of them had anticipated, forcing the confrontation with Celine into motion long before Kane's careful investigation had reached its intended conclusion. The council bell rang 3 times before dawn, an alarm reserved for only the gravest of pack emergencies, and Lyra was already dressed and moving toward the door before the 3rd chime had finished echoing across the territory. She found Peter Langley waiting outside her cabin, his expression grim in the pale early light. Celine has called an emergency session, he said without preamble. She's accusing you of conspiring against pack leadership. Kane sent me to warn you before enforcers arrive to escort you there formally. Lyra's stomach dropped. She knows about the investigation. It appears so, Peter said grimly. Someone must have alerted her that Kane has been asking questions about the bond ceremony. She's moving first, trying to discredit you before any formal evidence can be presented against her. Lyra glanced back toward the cabin where the twins still slept, torn between the instinct to stay and protect them directly, and the understanding that facing this confrontation head-on was the only way to end the danger permanently. Watch them, she said to Peter. Please, whatever happens to me in that council session. Grace is already on her way to sit with them, Peter said. Go. The elders are gathering now. The council hall stood at the center of pack territory, an ancient stone structure reserved for only the most significant gatherings, and by the time Lyra arrived, it was already filled with pack members drawn by whispers of an emergency session, unlike anything the territory had witnessed in recent memory. Celine stood at the center of the raised platform, dressed in formal ceremonial robes despite the early hour, her expression carefully arranged into something resembling righteous concern rather than the calculated malice Lyra knew lurked beneath the surface. The rejected Omega has been engaged in a deliberate campaign to undermine my authority as Luna, Celine announced, the moment Lyra entered the hall, her voice ringing clear across the gathered crowd. She has spread false accusations, manipulated the Alpha Heir's sympathies, and now stands accused of conspiring with outside parties to fabricate evidence against pack leadership. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, uncertain whether to believe the accusation or dismiss it as another chapter in the ongoing conflict between the two women. That's a lie, Lyra said, her voice steady despite the danger of the moment, walking forward to stand directly before the Elders' Council. I have made no false accusations. Every incident involving those children happened exactly as witnessed by multiple pack members, including enforcers assigned to carry out your own orders. And yet you continue insisting there was deliberate intent behind simple training accidents, Celine said smoothly, an insistence that conveniently aligns with rumors I've heard circulating about some supposed investigation into my bond with Kane. Kane entered the hall at that exact moment, flanked by the elderly trader Lyra had heard about days earlier, along with the pack's spiritual healer, an ancient woman named Alice Marrow who rarely appeared before public gatherings, given her advanced age and preference for solitude. There is indeed an investigation, Kane said, his voice carrying clear authority across the silent hall, one I initiated myself, based on legitimate concerns about the nature of our bond confirmation. Celine's composed expression flickered for the first time, genuine alarm bleeding through the careful mask she had maintained since the accusations began. You would question our sacred bond, in front of the entire pack, based on nothing more than baseless suspicion. Not baseless, Kane said, gesturing toward the trader standing nervously beside him. This man has agreed to testify regarding a transaction that occurred 2 weeks before our bond ceremony. A transaction involving a substance capable of artificially triggering false mate recognition. The hall erupted into shocked murmurs, and Celine's face drained of color, her carefully constructed composure finally cracking under the weight of public exposure. This is absurd, she said, though her voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. Some criminal trader's testimony, offered in exchange for leniency regarding his own illegal activities, holds no legitimate weight against a confirmed bond ceremony, witnessed by the entire Pack Elder Council. Which is precisely why I've also requested Elder Alice conduct a formal bond examination, Kane said, gesturing toward the ancient healer, who stepped forward with quiet dignity despite her advanced years. Her judgment on the authenticity of our connection will carry weight no accusation of criminal bias could ever undermine. Alice Marrow moved slowly toward Kane and Celine, her weathered hands raised toward each of them in turn, closing her clouded eyes as she concentrated on whatever ancient sense allowed her to perceive the true nature of a mate bond beyond simple physical attraction or social confirmation. The hall held its breath collectively as several long minutes passed in complete silence, broken only by the soft murmur of Alice's ancient incantations, her weathered face creasing with concentration as she probed deeper into the nature of the connection between them. Finally her eyes opened, and the verdict she delivered carried the weight of absolute, undeniable truth. There is no genuine bond, Alice said, her voice carrying clearly despite its frail quality. What exists between these two is artificial, manufactured through external means. I sense no true mate connection whatsoever. The hall erupted into chaos, shocked exclamations and outraged murmurs rippling through the crowd as the full implication of Alice's judgment settled over everyone present. Celine stumbled backward, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered, her eyes wide with the dawning horror of public exposure she had never anticipated facing. This cannot be, Celine said, though her voice had lost all its earlier authority, reduced now to something closer to desperate pleading. The elders confirmed the bond themselves, weeks ago, before the entire gathered pack. The elders confirmed what they perceived at the time, Elder Marin said, stepping forward from her seat among the council, her sharp eyes fixed on Celine with an intensity that promised no mercy for the deception she had perpetrated. A perception, it now appears, that was deliberately falsified through forbidden means. Kane turned to face Celine directly, his expression carrying none of the warmth or devotion he had shown her over the past weeks, only cold, righteous fury at the deception that had cost innocent people so much genuine suffering. You manufactured our bond, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You used a manufactured connection to seize authority over this pack. Authority you then used to torment 2 innocent children who never harmed anyone, and to punish a woman who protected them at tremendous cost to her own body. I did what I had to do, Celine said, desperation finally cracking through her composure entirely, revealing something far uglier beneath the surface she had maintained so carefully. I've spent years watching lesser wolves inherit positions of power simply through the accident of birth or fortunate circumstance, while I was passed over repeatedly despite my own ambitions and capabilities. The bond gave me a path to the authority I deserved, and I was not about to let some rejected Omega and two useless blind pups stand in my way. The word useless seemed to hang in the air of the hall, and Lyra felt something cold and furious settle into her chest at the casual cruelty of it, the offhand dismissal of two children who had suffered so much already at this woman's hands. "They are not useless," Lyra said, her voice cutting through the chaos of the hall with unmistakable authority. "They understand more about honesty and loyalty than you have ever demonstrated in your entire pursuit of power. And whatever punishment the elders decide to hand down for your deception, know that it will never come close to matching the harm you've inflicted on two innocent children who never deserved a single moment of the cruelty you visited upon them." Elder Marin raised a hand, calling for silence across the still murmuring hall, her expression grave as she addressed the full council of elders seated around her. "The evidence before us is undeniable," Marin said. "A manufactured bond, confirmed through both criminal testimony and spiritual examination, used to seize illegitimate authority within our pack structure, combined with the deliberate, repeated harm inflicted upon two vulnerable pack members under the guise of legitimate discipline. This constitutes one of the gravest violations of pack law in recent memory." She turned to address Celine directly, her voice carrying the full weight of ancient pack authority behind it. "Celine Marrow, you are hereby stripped of any claim to the title of Luna, effective immediately. Your presence within this pack's territory is no longer welcome. You will be escorted to the territorial boundary before sunset today, and you are forbidden from returning under penalty of the severest consequences our law allows." Celine's face crumpled, the full weight of exile finally landing with undeniable force, though whatever protest she might have offered died in her throat as she registered the unforgiving expressions surrounding her on every side, from elders and pack members alike. Enforcers moved forward to escort her from the hall, and she went without further resistance, her earlier confidence and calculated cruelty replaced entirely by the hollow recognition that everything she had built through deception had finally, completely collapsed around her. As the hall began to empty, murmurs of shock and vindication rippling through the departing crowd, Kane turned toward Lyra, his expression carrying something she had not seen from him since long before their rejection ceremony ever took place. "It's over," he said quietly, though something in his voice suggested he understood this ending marked not a conclusion, but the beginning of an entirely new chapter. Neither of them had yet found the words to properly discuss. Lyra's knees buckled the moment she stepped outside the council hall, the accumulated exhaustion of the past weeks finally overwhelming a body that had absorbed far more punishment than it should ever have been asked to bear. Kane caught her before she hit the ground, alarm flooding his features as he lowered her carefully onto the stone steps, calling frantically for Grace, who had been waiting nearby with the twins, anticipating exactly this kind of collapse once the immediate crisis of the council session had passed. "Her body has been running on pure will for weeks," Grace said grimly, kneeling beside them and pressing careful fingers against the pulse point at Lyra's wrist. "The broken arm, the whipping, the restraining frame, none of it has had proper time to heal, because she's refused every opportunity to actually rest." "I'm fine," Lyra murmured weakly, though the tremor in her voice betrayed the lie even as she spoke it. "You are not fine," Grace said firmly, already directing two nearby enforcers to help carry her toward the healing hut. "You have been running on stubbornness and love alone, and both of those, admirable as they are, cannot substitute for actual physical recovery." Ren and Finn hovered close as Lyra was carried away, their small faces creased with worry, their blind eyes turned toward the sound of her weakened breathing with an intensity that broke Kane's heart to witness. "Is she going to be okay?" Finn asked, his voice trembling. "She will be," Kane said, kneeling down to their level, his voice steady, despite the fear coiling through his own chest at how pale and fragile Lyra had looked, collapsing onto those stone steps. "But she needs proper rest now, without anyone, including the two of you, worrying her further by hovering constantly at her bedside." "We won't leave her," Ren said fiercely, her small chin lifting with unmistakable determination. Kane's expression softened at the fierce loyalty in her voice, recognizing in this small blind girl the same unwavering devotion Lyra herself had demonstrated so many times over the preceding weeks. "I wouldn't dream of asking you to," he said gently, "but we can sit quietly together while Grace works, can't we? Let her heal, without extra worry weighing on her mind." The twins nodded solemnly, allowing Kane to take each of their hands as they followed the healing party toward Grace's hut, walking together in a silence heavy with shared concern for the woman who had become, in every meaningful sense, the center of all their lives. Grace worked through the following hours with quiet efficiency, treating the accumulated damage of weeks of unaddressed injury while Lyra drifted in and out of exhausted, fevered sleep. Kane remained at her bedside throughout, refusing every suggestion that he attend to other pressing pack matters requiring his attention. Following Celine's exile, his focus entirely fixed on the woman whose fierce, selfless love had exposed truths about his own pack's failures that he could never fully repay. The fever is a natural response to her body finally being allowed to process everything it's endured, Grace explained quietly, checking Lyra's temperature again as evening settled over the territory. She needs several days of complete rest. No more punishments to intercept, no more children to protect from immediate danger. Simply time to heal. She'll have that, Kane said with quiet determination. I intend to make certain of it personally. By the third day, Lyra's fever finally broke, and she woke to find sunlight streaming through the small windows of Grace's healing hut, along with the quiet, steady sound of Kane's breathing from the chair positioned beside her bed, where he had apparently spent every night of her recovery rather than returning to his own quarters. You didn't need to stay, she said softly, her voice still weak, but considerably stronger than it had been days earlier. Kane's eyes opened immediately, alert, despite the exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath them. I wanted to, he said simply. Every moment of the past week has shown me exactly how much I failed to understand about the woman I was married to, and exactly how much courage that woman has demonstrated, in circumstances that would have broken most people entirely. Lyra studied his face carefully, searching for any trace of obligation or guilt-driven affection rather than genuine feeling, finding only earnest sincerity staring back at her. Where are the twins? She asked. Asleep in the adjoining room, Kane said. They've barely left the hut since you were brought here, though Grace has managed to convince them to eat and rest properly despite their worry. Lyra smiled softly at the thought of the twins' fierce loyalty, warmth spreading through her chest despite the lingering weakness in her body. They mean everything to me, she said quietly. I know, Kane said. I heard you say as much, the night before the council session. I wasn't intending to eavesdrop, but I found myself standing outside your cabin, as I had every night for weeks, and I couldn't help but hear the conversation happening inside. Lyra's cheeks flushed slightly, though she found she did not mind the thought of him witnessing that particular moment of unguarded honesty. Then you already know how I feel about them. I do, Kane said, and I would like, if you'll allow it, the opportunity to earn a place alongside that love you've built with them, not as their alpha, exercising authority over pack matters, but as someone who genuinely wants to help you raise them, protect them, and give them the life they deserve after everything this pack has failed to provide until now. Lyra was quiet for a long moment, considering the weight of what he was offering, understanding that accepting it meant opening herself to vulnerability she had sworn off entirely following her rejection weeks earlier. You hurt me, she said finally, honestly. Not through malice, but through neglect. 2 years of marriage, and you never once asked me the questions that mattered. I cannot simply forget that pain because circumstances have shifted in my favor. I know, Kane said, accepting the truth of her words without argument. I'm not asking you to forget it. I'm asking for the chance to become someone worthy of a second consideration, built slowly, through actions rather than empty promises, however long that takes. Lyra studied him for a long moment, weighing the sincerity in his voice against the pain of everything she had endured, before finally allowing herself a small, tentative smile. We can start there, she said quietly, slowly, with actions, not promises. Kane's answering smile carried more genuine relief and hope than she had ever witnessed from him during their entire arranged marriage, and something settled between them in that quiet healing hut, fragile but real, the first honest foundation either of them had ever built together. Outside, word of Celine's exile and the full truth behind her manufactured bond had spread through every corner of pack territory, transforming the narrative surrounding Lyra from rejected Omega to something the pack was only beginning to properly understand and honor. Elder Marin's ancient prophecy, once dismissed as mere superstition, now circulated through the territory with renewed significance, whispered among pack members who finally recognized the pattern that had been unfolding before their eyes all along. The discarded shield had risen, exactly as the old words foretold, and the pack that once cast her aside now found itself reckoning with the true cost of the cruelty it had allowed to flourish under false authority. But reckoning, Lyra understood as she drifted back into peaceful, healing sleep with the sound of Kane's steady breathing beside her, was only the beginning. What came next would determine whether this pact deserved the redemption it now seemed so eager to claim. The clearing filled faster than it had for any gathering in recent memory, every corner of pack territory, emptying as word spread that Elder Marin herself had called for a formal ceremony, unlike anything witnessed in generations. 2 weeks had passed since Celine's exile, and Lyra's body had finally healed enough to stand without support, her arm freed from its splint, the marks along her back fading into thin, pale lines that Grace assured her would eventually disappear entirely. She stood now at the edge of the ceremonial circle, dressed in simple, unadorned clothing, with Ren and Finn holding tightly to each of her hands, their small faces turned upward with an anticipation that mirrored the quiet nervousness building in her own chest. Elder Marin stood at the circle's center, flanked by the full council of pack elders, her weathered face carrying an expression of solemn purpose that immediately silenced the murmuring crowd the moment she raised her hands for attention. Weeks ago, Marin began, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered pack, this territory witnessed a rejection ceremony that stripped a woman of her position, her home, and her dignity, based on a bond we now know to have been entirely fabricated through deliberate deception. The crowd remained silent, many faces carrying visible shame at the memory of how easily they had accepted Lyra's public humiliation weeks earlier, how quickly they had turned their backs on a woman who had done nothing to deserve such treatment. In the weeks following that unjust rejection, Marin continued, this same woman endured punishment after punishment, sacrificing her own body repeatedly to protect 2 children this pack had long dismissed as burdens rather than treasures. She did so without recognition, without reward, without any expectation of gratitude, motivated only by a fierce and unconditional love that this pack utterly failed to recognize or honor. Marin turned slightly, gesturing toward the ancient stone tablet that stood at the circle's edge, inscribed with symbols and words that few pack members had ever bothered to study closely, given its association with prophecies most dismissed as superstitious relics of a bygone era. There exists an old prophecy within our tradition, Marin said, speaking of a discarded shield, a protector cast aside by her own pack, who rises to guard what others refuse to value. Many among us, myself included, once considered this prophecy little more than a comforting story told to ease the pain of the powerless. She paused, her sharp eyes sweeping across the gathered crowd before settling on Lyra with unmistakable respect. We were wrong to dismiss it so easily. The crowd murmured, and Lyra felt her cheeks flush with a mixture of embarrassment and overwhelming emotion at being spoken of in such reverent terms after weeks of enduring exactly the opposite treatment from this same gathered pack. Kane stepped forward then, moving to stand beside Lyra and the twins, his expression carrying the same solemn purpose reflected in Elder Marin's words. I stand before this pack today, Kane said, his voice carrying clear authority despite the emotion evident beneath its surface, to formally and publicly reject any remaining claim tied to the false bond that once bound me to Celine Marrow. That bond was never genuine. It was manufactured deception, and I refuse to allow even the memory of it to cast any further shadow over this pack's future. He turned then, facing Lyra directly, his eyes carrying an openness she had never witnessed from him during their entire previous marriage, arranged and dutiful rather than chosen and genuine. And I stand before this pack to say, without reservation or obligation, that the woman standing before you today is someone I choose freely, not through arrangement or political convenience, but through genuine admiration for her courage, her fierce and unconditional love, and her unwavering commitment to protecting those the world too easily discards. The crowd fell utterly silent, every eye fixed on the unfolding scene with rapt attention. I am not asking for immediate forgiveness for my own failures, Kane continued, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability evident in every word. I understand that trust, once broken through years of neglect, cannot simply be restored through a single public declaration, but I am asking this pack to witness my commitment to earning that trust, slowly, through action, rather than empty promise, for as long as it takes. He knelt then, before the entire gathered pack, taking Lyra's hand gently in his own. Lyra Voss, he said, will you allow me the chance to build something real between us, alongside these 2 children who have already taught me more about genuine love than I ever understood during our previous marriage? Lyra felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the public vulnerability of his declaration, by the weight of everything they had endured together over the preceding weeks, by the fragile, hopeful possibility of a future built on honesty rather than obligation. Yes, she said softly, her voice carrying clearly across the silent circle despite its quiet delivery. I will. The crowd erupted into applause, relief and joy rippling through the gathered pack as the tension of the preceding weeks finally broke into something resembling genuine celebration. Elder Marin raised her hands again, calling for quiet as she prepared to deliver the ceremony's final and most significant declaration. By the authority granted to this council, Marin announced, we formally reinstate Lyra Voss to full standing within this pack, not merely restored to her previous position, but elevated to recognition, as the discarded shield foretold in our oldest traditions. Furthermore, we formally recognize Ren and Finn as her adopted children, entitled to every protection and privilege this pack can offer, regardless of their blindness, which this pack should have recognized long ago as no measure whatsoever of their worth. She turned toward the twins, her weathered face softening with genuine warmth as she addressed them directly. Children, she said gently, this pack failed you terribly in the time since your parents' deaths. We allowed fear and ignorance to convince us that your blindness made you burdens rather than blessings. That failure lies with us, not with you, and we owe you an apology this pack should have offered long before circumstances forced our hand toward proper recognition. Ren's small hand tightened around Lyra's fingers. Her blind eyes turned upward toward the sound of Marin's voice, with an expression of cautious hope that broke every heart witnessing it. Does this mean we get to stay? Finn asked quietly, his voice carrying the particular vulnerability of a child who had learned, through hard experience, not to trust promises too easily. It means far more than simply staying, Marin said, kneeling down carefully to bring herself closer to the twins' level. It means this pack finally recognizes what Lyra understood from the very beginning, that you are treasures worth protecting, worth celebrating, and worth every ounce of love this pack should have given you from the day you were born. The ceremony concluded with a celebration unlike anything the pack had witnessed in generations, pack members who had once looked away from the twins, now approaching them with genuine warmth, offering apologies and small gestures of welcome that Ren and Finn accepted with the same open-hearted grace they brought to everything else in their young lives. As evening settled over the territory, Lyra sat beneath the old oak tree at the clearing's edge, the same tree where Ren and Finn had once waited anxiously while she endured the whipping post weeks earlier, watching now as the twins played nearby with several other pack children, their laughter carrying freely across the grass in a way that would have seemed impossible only a month before. Kane settled beside her, his shoulder brushing gently against hers, both of them watching the twins with matching expressions of quiet contentment. We did it, Kane said softly. They did it, Lyra corrected gently, nodding toward the twins. Every bit of courage this pack finally found came from watching two blind children endure cruelty with more grace than most adults could manage. I simply refused to let that courage go unprotected. Kane took her hand gently, lacing his fingers through hers, and for the first time since their arranged marriage had begun years earlier, the gesture carried none of the dutiful obligation that had once defined every moment between them. Whatever comes next, he said quietly, I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain neither you nor those children ever have to face cruelty like that again, not because pack law demands it, but because you have taught me exactly what genuine protection actually means. Lyra leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the twins laugh together in the golden light of the setting sun, feeling for the first time in longer than she could remember, a sense of peace that carried no shadow of fear beneath its surface. The discarded shield had found her place at last, not simply restored to what she once had, but elevated to something far more meaningful, surrounded by a family built not through arrangement or obligation, but through genuine, unconditional love that no manufactured bond could ever hope to replicate. And as the twins' laughter continued ringing across the clearing, carried on the evening breeze toward a future finally free of the cruelty that had once defined their short, difficult lives, Lyra allowed herself, for the very first time, to simply breathe, to simply rest, to simply believe that the hardest part of their story had finally come to an end.